Is it possible with the levels that we're at today that we kind of get a repeat of what we got at the end of the dot-com bubble, which is, today Microsoft clearly a massive long-term winner, but it did trade below its pre-2001 peak for 7 or 8 years afterwards. Could that happen to all crypto assets from where we stand today?
Yeah, Wilfred, I would be shocked if that was the outcome here. I mean, I was just looking a few minutes ago to see that where Bitcoin was a year ago was at 19,000. And right now, at a moment where we're all talking about panic, it's at 53,000. That's a pretty extraordinary one-year rate of return and nothing like you saw in some of those other corrections you're talking about. What I think is this is still a new asset class. People are still understanding its role in a portfolio, and it will have some turbulence on the climb out. But the direction of travel is up, and I expect that to continue as people adopt the network.
Weirdly, I think the point you just made is sort of something that suggests we're not due to pull back is exactly the reason why a lot of people think that we are, because the pullback is only tiny relative to the extraordinary stratospheric rise, not just over the last 12 months, but the last 4 or 5 years that these assets have enjoyed.
Yeah, I guess that's right. But, an interesting data point many people don't understand is that in the worst of the crypto bear markets, something like 80+% of the holders of crypto assets aren't selling. So all of the price movement is all determined by a small number of relative newbies and price speculators. But the people who are the major holders tend not to sell over time at all. And so to me, that says a lot more about the future of the asset and the stability of the asset than short-term sellers who are only recent adopters of the asset class to begin with.
So this hearing is kind of a big deal. First time we've seen the big players in Bitcoin come on the Hill to testify and answer questions. How are you preparing, and how do you see this moment?
Well, look, the great thing for me is this is not my first rodeo testifying in front of this group of members of Congress. And so for me, it's one of those issues of organizing my thoughts a little bit and making clear what the messages are. But what I think the two most important things are that the committee is going to consider are, first of all, are we or are we not going to resolve some of the contradictions in U.S. crypto policy? Sarah, just to give you an example of that, we've got an administration that has taken the position that only banks should be able to issue stable coins. But it seems like the posture of the administration is also that companies that issue stable coins can't be banks. So my hope is we'll talk a little bit about how do we resolve some of these Kafkaesque contradictions. And the second thing I hope to talk about is the way that crypto and Bitcoin mining in particular can be part of the solution for an environmentally sustainable future. I think this is one of the most badly misunderstood aspects of crypto, and I expect it will get some airtime next week.
As things stand, Brian, I think everyone sort of assumes that it's traditional finance, big banks and central banks versus the crypto world, and one or the other will win, but both can't win. How tall an order is it that coming together, the administration and the DeFi world can harness the power of blockchain and decentralized finance in a way that in 10 years' time, even governments, even central banks, even the old school will look back and see it all as a big positive win, where the Western world, in fact, benefits overall?
Well, look, the problem is that governments give up their power very, very reluctantly. And a big part of what crypto is about is putting financial power in the hands of users as opposed to in the hands of intermediaries. And the ultimate intermediary is the central bank. So that's going to take some doing, I think. And I think you asked the question in a really smart way when you talk about 10 years out, because I think the next 3 to 5 years are going to be a difficult transition period where people with their hands on the levers of power are going to have a hard time relinquishing it. What hopefully we'll see over that time is that the growth of crypto assets acts as a check on monetary policy that debases our currency and induces inflation. And once you see that this is part of price stability, it's not something that destroys the system, but it reinforces it and makes it safer and less subject to politicization. I think that's when we will look back in 10 years' time and say this was a really good development.
Did you see the latest Charlie Munger quote on Bitcoin? He was quoted at a conference in Sydney, Australia, saying he wishes cryptocurrencies had never been invented, and actually said he admires China for outright banning them. I know you guys are no stranger in this industry to some of these attacks, especially from older investors, but you will face some heat at the hearing next week along these lines, that it is a place that is ripe for cybersecurity theft and drug dealing and all sorts of illicit behavior. So how do you respond to all of that?
Look, I suppose that's true, but I also remember in the early days of the internet where the main things going on the original World Wide Web were bank scams and pornography. And the World Wide Web still has exactly the same amount of bank scams and pornography on it as it did back then, but it also has Amazon and Expedia and all kinds of foundational innovations. So when people who are as smart as Charlie Munger, my fellow Pasadenan and somebody I respect greatly, say things like that, I think it's because they're not understanding that the analogy here is to the internet. This is not a speculative asset class. This is a tool that is building fundamental networks that are going to change the world and allow people to own the internet in a way that they weren't able to in a different iteration. I think that he'll come to realize that. But, there's some people who get to a point in their careers where any asset that wasn't an asset when they were a Goldman Sachs partner will never be legit to them. And if that's what we're dealing with, so be it. There's a new generation coming online now.
Dollar's up 7% year to date. This newfound strength in the dollar, does that hurt your argument, the Bitcoin argument?
Well, the dollar's up 7%, Bitcoin's up 300% over the same time period. So I guess my point would be, if I had to put money in a haven, I would want to make sure that I've got a certain asset allocation to Bitcoin. I really would. Over time, it's grown faster and created more value than any other innovation in the last 50 years. This went from $0 to $2.5 trillion in 10.5 years. It's really hard to argue with that.
Thank you for joining us, Brian. It's good to hear from you, especially ahead of that testimony next week. Keep us posted. Brian Brooks. We've got just under 40 minutes to go before the bell. Sell-off day again on Wall Street. It's been a tough week for the bulls. Take a look at the market right now. We've got the Dow down 0.75%, down 250. So we are off those session lows. The S&P is off 1.5%. It's the Nasdaq feeling the most pain today, down almost 400 points, or 2.6%. After the break, sign of the time.